Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Big headline crossing the terminal just as we take air at high noon. It happens every day. That's why you listen and watch on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Business News live. We'll be there with our live stream when you arrive. Also on Bloomberg Radio nationwide on Sirius XM channel 121. Bessent sees de-escalation with China, reads the headline. Situation unsustainable. Even though that is the very situation that this White House asked for with China, trying as ever to get Beijing to the table. We're watching shares of Tesla, by the way. Charlie pointed that out, not only because of the implications when it comes to China, right? Everyone's going to be looking at Nike, going to be looking at Tesla, also with earnings in the cards. Will we hear from Elon Musk in the conference call? That's one question we have and one stock that we are watching here as we project to the after-hours session. In the meantime, at the White House, it's damage control, right? Sat here at this very time yesterday, and we spent 2 hours talking about Pete Hegseth. A second signal chat, of course, sharing what he says are not war plans with his wife, brother, and others. And then the departure of 4 people who he hired, shown the door for being alleged leakers. Now, what do you do in a world like this? We already told you that the president was standing behind his man. He said so at the Easter egg roll of all places yesterday. But you got to get out in the media, right? And of course, when you want to do that in the Trump administration, you tend to go to Fox News. Pete Hegseth showed up on Fox and Friends this morning to make his case. Listen.
I said repeatedly, no one's texting war plans. You know why I said that? Because I'm in the bowels of the Pentagon every single day. Just 10 minutes ago, I was looking at actual war plans of things that were ongoing or pending things to happen, because that's on a regular basis on classified systems. That's my job for the war fighters, for the president of the United States. I look at war plans every single day. What was shared over Signal then and now, however you characterize it, was informal, unclassified coordinations.
Informal, unclassified coordinations that also included, of course, the type of aircraft, the F-A-18 fighter jets that were used and when they were going to be in position, which has raised a lot of questions about the security surrounding this whole conversation. Yes, CC, however you want to characterize it. He essentially blamed the agency as well, being a house of leakers and trying to block the Trump agenda. Does this help to put this to bed? I don't know, but this is where we start with Kate Sullivan, part of our growing team covering this Trump administration. Bloomberg White House correspondent. Kate, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So we got the first attempt here to tamp this down. And by the way, not the first time for Hegseth himself, following the first signal chat and following his confirmation hearings, in which a lot of people said that he was DOA. This White House isn't budging, though, right? He's still got the support of the president.
That's right. I mean, we heard Trump yesterday. And with Trump, right, he's firmly behind you until he's not.
Okay.
So we will see how this plays out. But for right now, we definitely are hearing Trump and the White House stand behind him. I think also it's important to remember how much political capital the president spent on getting Hegseth confirmed. I think that's a factor here as we're sort of looking at this, because the Hegseth confirmation battle was the hardest one, and it's the one that Trump really got personally involved with, and he spent a lot of his own, capital and influence on this. So I think having Hegseth leave just a few months into the administration would be sort of a admission that there was a mistake there, which is not something we see very often from the president.
Not on brand for Donald Trump. We're not even at 100 days yet, right? We're about 91 days, I think, is today.
100 days.
He doesn't want that
soon.
Headline. Didn't get through the first 100 days. You wonder if that milestone means something to him, but it also could weaken Pete Hegseth in the long term, internally, could it not?
Yes, and I think we're seeing the Pentagon right now really in turmoil. I know you've covered this on this show, but what we saw from Hegseth this morning was a really defiant, in the face of all this. As you mentioned, he's been through news cycles like this before, but he's very defiant. He's blamed the media, which is something that this president and this White House and this administration, it's something that they revert to sort of reflexively a lot. Sure. I will say that as watching those clips from this morning, it is interesting. He did not deny the existence of the chat.
I'm glad you mentioned this.
Yes, I was going to say he did not deny the existence of it.
Called it old news, so apparently he thought we already knew about it.
Right, and so and it was shared with his brother and his wife, among other people. Sensitive information. He says that it was unclassified. Yeah. And I think also it's the venue for where he did this defiant sort of as he's defending himself. I also just want to note that he went on Fox and Friends on Fox. Hegseth is a former Fox News host.
Yes,
he was appearing with his colleagues.
That's right.
He not only was a Fox host, but he was a former Fox and Friends weekend host. So it's a very friendly format
in the
for
franchise.
Him.
Well, Brian Kilmeade, who did this interview at one point, referred to how difficult it is. You're trying to just keep the world under control, and we know what a hard job that is. So they clearly wanted him to have a friendly environment.
That's right. That's right.
You wonder if he advanced the story at all here, because you're right. He acknowledged essentially that this was real, that this signal chat was true. He did not deny it. He also made reference to media coordination. Was he preparing to send you coordinates on this? What was that a reference to?
I believe, there's this sense, and you heard Caroline Levitt say this too, that the way they're framing this, the way the White House is framing this, is that there's a lot of opposition within the Pentagon to Hegseth himself, and they're trying to say, there are people there who are just working against and trying to sabotage Hegseth. Hegseth mentioned in the interview this morning this investigation that they're doing on the leaks. We saw the senior aides depart in recent days, and he's also it was interesting to me. He was trying to really distance himself from those people, but some of and saying just that these as if they weren't close to him at all. But some of these people have been in his orbit, have been close advisors to him for a long time. So that was interesting to me. But overall, just this sense of everything is sort of the deep state, as Trump likes to talk about, and that there's this sort of overarching effort to undermine his efforts personally.
The calls coming from inside the house, even though he brought in the 4 people who were fired last week.
Yes,
who we talked about quite a bit yesterday. And by the way, we understand there could be more. This John Elliott, who was shown the door, or found the door himself, depending on who you ask. If he wasn't in charge, he wasn't going to do anything in the press office. He says there are more bombshells to follow. So we'll park that for a minute. The fact of the matter is, Kate, this has taken our eye off the ball on tariffs and a lot of the other stories that you've been covering at the White House. The president does have an event. It's set for 4 o'clock. The new SEC chair. Will you think he'll make some news? Does he want to bring the press pool in? I mean, this happens every day, right? You go to work, it says close press, then all of a sudden you're in the Oval Office.
That actually happened to me on Friday. Dr. Oz's swearing in was supposed to be closed press, and then they opened it up, and it was actually a great opportunity to ask Trump. Whenever they do open it up, and whenever you do bring reporters into the Oval Office, it's a really important opportunity to ask the president questions directly.
Yeah, tends to move the markets on a lot of days as well.
That's exactly right. And so, I'm not sure about later today exactly what's going to come out of that, but if there are opportunities for questions, or if there are reporters in the room, or even if we're just waiting for a readout, I think definitely there could be.
This is the life of a White House correspondent. You're hearing about it in real time. We only have a minute left, Kate. There was news from the White House of the president, in fact, on Truth Social, had a phone call with Benjamin Netanyahu. Will Israel be the first country to cut a deal on tariffs?
We don't know is the short answer, but I think Netanyahu, made a big show to come in person to talk to Trump. I think a lot of people in Israel, a lot of officials were really surprised by that 17% tariff. I think that they thought that because of some of the overtures that they had made and some of the, how they'd been handling this, that it wouldn't be quite so high. So the White House has said that they are actively considering on paper proposals from 15 different nations. And so we will see if Israel is one of the first, or if they do some kind of a batch of them. But
fascinating.
We're not sure yet.
Need to go to Rome first. President will be attending the papal funeral on Saturday. Kate Sullivan, thank you so much for being with us. Bloomberg White House correspondent. Don't be a stranger. This conversation isn't going to end anytime soon.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
The pandemic is officially over at the Department of Education. April 21, just yesterday, word went out from the agency. The debt collector will soon be calling. Department of Education to begin federal student loan collections and other actions, it says, to help borrowers get back into repayment. Collections to restart May 5th. Struggling borrowers urged to act now. When you look at the statement here from the Department of Education, quote, there will not be any mass loan forgiveness, unquote. Remembering more than 42 million people, this affects a lot of people, hold student loans from the federal government. They total more than $1.6 trillion in debt, according to the department. More than 5 million holders of student loans have not made a repayment in the past year. And so the phone calls are going to start coming in at the beginning of next month. That is where we start our conversation with our political panel. Lots to cover today with Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist, and partner at Stone Court Capital. And if you're with us on YouTube, you see Kristen Hahn, Democratic strategist, partner at Rock Solutions. Great to see you both. Kristen, welcome back. We talked a lot about loan forgiveness in the Biden administration. I guess this is the other side of the coin.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we were going through a pandemic. There was the loan forgiveness, and then there was the delay, with having people repay their loans. Now, the people who have had loan forgiveness, there has been a bit of whiplash from administration to administration with these policies. So we need to take that into account when we're thinking about people's planning and ability to repay these loans. That said, those commitments should be honored to the people whose loans have already been forgiven. I'm not that we're not asking people to pay the money back right now, but whose have been forgiven. But I do think, we're moving on from the pandemic. It was a really tough time. People were struggling financially, due to circumstances beyond their control. But we're getting back to a more normal economy, and people should pay back their loans. That said, I think if our economy dives into a recession due to some of the president's policies, people might have more problems doing that. But asking people to start making payments on their loans, maybe it should have been a little bit more of a lead time, is not a bad thing.
What do you think about this, Rick? More than 5 million holders of student loans have not made a repayment in the past year. Is that because of the language that was coming out of the Biden White House? Stand by for forgiveness?
It's hard to tell what was the motivation, whether it was their own economic circumstances, whether they thought they could get away with not repaying any of the loans, or whether or not this is sort of typical for the loan program. I mean, I don't know how many, say, deadbeat loan holders are typical, even before the pandemic hit. I mean, it is kind of the end of the last pandemic refuge put into place back in 2020. So it makes sense that we'd finally get this done. I'd say the whiplash that we've been talking about on this program is really what happened to Joe Biden. He kept trying to give relief to student loan holders, and the courts told him no twice.
Yeah, right.
And so that era is over. You won't see the president trying to find ways to create debt relief by folks who hold these loans. If anything, turning these over to debt collectors is going to cause some, legitimate misery. And if they don't pay, they could wind up having wages garnished and things like that. So this is entering a whole new cycle. Elections have consequences. Mm-hmm. Well, folks, guess what? Your debt is due.
Yeah, that's right. And some 9 million could find themselves in default here once we get past May 5th if payments aren't made. Kristen, did Joe Biden confuse a lot of voters to think they didn't have to pay their loans anymore here? What do you make of the numbers that we're seeing here? Do you, as a Democrat, regret that being a major pillar of the Biden administration? He came back time and again, shot down by the Supreme Court, and made this a major priority for his administration. Remember the SAVE plan? That's been frozen by the court since August. Was it a waste of time?
I'm not sure if it was a waste of time. I know a number of people who, work in government service on Capitol Hill, in the agencies who really have benefited from some of that loan forgiveness and put it to good use and done good work and even gone back to work for the government. So, I don't think it was all loss. I think communicating it to the American public should have been a pillar of what we were doing. I'm not sure about that, but communicating it better, certainly it could have been better. But like I said, that's the problem when you have these executive orders, no matter what they are. Like I said, it's like whiplash from one administration to the next. Same thing with our foreign policy and our trade policy. Only long lasting, change comes through a bipartisan compromise and goes through the legislative process. So this will continue to go back and forth, I think, when you see and confuse the American people when you see, these EOs taking effect.
Well, I don't know how many Harvard students we're talking about here, Rick, but there is news about Harvard and its federal funding, which is something that we've talked about quite a bit lately as the administration moves to cut off some $2 billion in grants, $2.2 billion. And so Harvard, maybe no surprise, is suing the U.S. agencies involved here and top officials for freezing the funding, creating a real standoff here as the first school to say no and now to sue. Rick, you may not be surprised by this, but can Harvard win?
Look, I mean, they've got a case to be made at Harvard. The administration has even admitted that the letter they sent to Harvard requiring, basically an overseer for their programs and management of the university was a mistake. But it's not like they've rescinded any of these threats, right? It's not like they said, oh, forget about it, that $9 billion, we're good for it. And so, Harvard is being precautious and going to the courts. I mean, just like we were just talking about, Joe Biden's challenges with the courts on his student loan program. Donald Trump's been challenged by the courts on virtually every EO he's submitted. And maybe we're just in this litigious kind of rule by legal fiat. And, I'm just going to do whatever I want to do as an administration, regardless of the way the rules work, ignoring the idea of a bipartisan compromise on Capitol Hill to get things done, which Kristen Hahn's right. That's the way to actually govern. This is a very similar thing where now Harvard's going to say, we're calling your cards. If you've got an ace in there, you better show it, because otherwise we're actually going to make it harder in the future for the administration to take on universities.
Well, of course, you know this story well, Kristen. The administration claims that Harvard failed to enforce civil rights laws to protect Jewish students. The lawsuit reads, the government has not and cannot identify any rational connection between anti-Semitism concerns and the medical, scientific, technological, and other research that it has frozen that aims to save American lives, foster American success, preserve American security, and maintain America's position as a global leader in innovation. If Harvard wins this lawsuit, will that be the precedent for every other university we're talking about here, Columbia and so on?
I mean, I think you're looking at a lot of universities, across the board. And yes, I mean, certainly if Harvard wins, the legal precedent would be very important for, like they said, I mean, you're looking at, a lot of the research and development, R&D that comes out of the United States of America is born at our colleges and universities. It's not just Harvard, it's in, states all over this country on any number of different areas. So, I think that it would be an important legal precedent to be set if Harvard wins this.
That's the end of this drive by the White House. If Harvard wins here, Rick, right? What happens to Columbia, Northwestern, Cornell, and the rest?
Well, if Harvard wins, Columbia is going to have a lot of, regrets that they cut a deal with the Trump administration. And there are, 100 university presidents have just signed, a compact to talk about how the government should stay out of their business, basically. So you are seeing this sort of coalition get created. I mean, obviously, we got thousands of universities in the United States, but when you start seeing universities working together like this, you realize that there are constituencies for the way things have been working. And look, I've always thought it was kind of an odd thing to attack universities over their poor management of keeping their campuses free of anti-Semitism, when so much of what you're talking about impacting them has nothing to do with that kind of an issue. I mean, the congressional hearings, I thought, did a better job of creating change with universities after the spring uprisings on these university campuses, because they changed the leadership. They didn't do a good job of managing their universities, and so they got a new president. And I thought that was particularly useful role for Congress, to show that these are universities that were poorly managed. But to actually get into the nitty gritty of deciding what programs they're going to teach, that's a even for Americans who aren't that happy with liberal teachings at universities, that's probably a step too far.
You do wonder what the real end goal is here, Kristen. Linda McMahon, Secretary, at least for now, Department of Education, while it exists, was on the other network this morning, said that the letter that they sent to Harvard, the demand letter, was, quote, a point of negotiation, and said she hopes the university would come back to the table. So is this just like the tariffs?
I was about to say, I think that you have to think about, in any negotiation, who you are negotiating with. And clearly, Harvard is taking a very strong stand and defending their activities and their research and everything that they have to offer. And they know that they're setting a precedent for other colleges and universities with major departments like this across the country. So I think they may have overplayed their cards a little bit here.
Well, I'll tell you, it's an interesting day with, you talk about the whiplash, the back and forth, and the uncertainty. It's an up day on Wall Street. It's whipping higher here after what we heard from Scott Bessent, and we'll get into that a little bit more in our next hour.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts, or watch us live on YouTube.
Let's talk about the economic outlook changing that we got from the IMF today as it downgrades its global growth forecasts, and big hit to the forecast specifically for the U.S. and China, given the circumstances with which we were just discussing. We heard from the IMF chief economist Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas about the forecast earlier today.
Beyond the abrupt increase in tariffs, the surge in policy uncertainty is a major driver of the economic outlook. If sustained, the increase in trade tensions and uncertainty will slow global growth significantly.
So let's get more into this now with Bloomberg International Economics and Policy correspondent Michael McKee, who is here with us in Washington. And when we consider the uncertainty in this forecast, we also have to consider the time at which these forecasts were made. April 4th is what assumptions they were using, tariffs that stood as they were on that day. We have seen a massive escalation in the tariffs between the U.S. and China since then. So when they're issuing warnings about growth being downgraded for the U.S. and China, there's actually plenty of room for that to get worse, Mike.
Yeah, and that was their second go at estimating what was going to happen to the global economy, because they'd already started preparing. And then when Trump announced the tariffs, they had to throw all that out and start over again. They did several different scenarios. And the one that we are all talking about is what they're calling the reference scenario. It's sort of their baseline at this point, but obviously things are going to change because we have no idea as of today what the tariffs are going to be. Right. But you're right, they do forecast a big drop in growth, not only for the U.S. and China, but for the world. The U.S. takes it on the chin by almost a full percentage point, down to 1.5% growth this year. That's from their forecast in January. So in 2 months, we've lost a percentage point. And the Chinese, they say, will grow just 3.2%. And as you know, they don't seem to like the idea of going below 5%, even if they have to kind of massage the numbers.
Gourinchas says we are entering a new era. The global economic system that has operated for the last 80 years is being reset. How long does it take for a new era to be set?
Well, we'd all love to know. And part of the problem there is, what is Donald Trump going to do? And then how long is it going to take him? And then What does he continue to do? At some point, does he say, okay, this is it, we're going ahead with tariffs? At some point, does he say, okay, we've accomplished what we want? Maybe he makes trade deals instead of doing tariffs. So nobody really knows what's going to happen. I think that the bottom line for what Pierre-Olivier is saying is that nobody can trust the United States anymore. And it used to be that the U.S. was the lodestar. Everybody followed what the U.S. was doing. But now people can't do that, so they have to prepare. Central banks have to prepare. Legislatures have to prepare and try to figure out what works best for their country, absent any idea what the U.S. is going to do.
Well, on your point on central banks, Mike, it stands out to me that the growth figures the IMF released today, the worst since 2009, or since COVID, second worst since 2009, times at which we were seeing central banks respond to these massive economic issues by easing policy. And yet, at least for the Federal Reserve, they don't necessarily find themselves in a place right now where they're eager to ease policy because of inflationary risks that are out there. The response will be different this time.
The IMF is forecasting that inflation is going to go up in the United States, not much in the rest of the world, a little bit, because it'll be somewhat disinflationary since the economies of all these countries are going to slow. But in the U.S., we're going to slow, but we're also going to see faster inflation, which leaves the U.S. in this awful position that Jay Powell was talking about last week of what do? Do you raise rates to choke off inflation, in which case you make the slowdown worse, or vice versa? So at this point, the IMF view was we really don't know what's going to happen, but whatever it is, it's not going to be good.
Bloomberg's Michael McKee with us in Washington. Nice to have you in the Capitol for a couple of days. We're going to have a lot to talk about with Mr. McKee as we add the voice of Constance Hunter, chief economist, EIU. Constance, it's great to have you with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. The IMF forecast that we're talking about increases the odds of a recession here in the U.S. to 40%, up from 27% in October. Where are you?
We're much higher than that. I would say closer to 80%. And that's because the level of uncertainty that we're seeing is so significantly high. I mean, it is higher than the global financial crisis. It is higher than when the U.S. debt was downgraded in 2011, and higher than any previous recession going back to the 80s when this index was created. So we think that means that there is a significant reduction in CapEx. We hear that from our clients. We also are starting to see signs that you're seeing discretionary spending pull back on the part of consumers. And of course, that leads to a vicious circle where you see fewer and fewer jobs growth, eventually a negative jobs print. And so our baseline forecast is for negative 0.1% growth for all of 2025 for the U.S.
So considering that picture you're painting, Constance, it doesn't look like a very optimistic one for the U.S. economy. I wonder what you made when President Trump yesterday spoke on True Social about the calls for preemptive cuts from the Federal Reserve. He obviously thinks interest rates need to go down now. Is there a case to be made for that view if there is indeed such a dour outlook ahead of us?
Well, as Mike McKee pointed out, and we've been saying, the U.S. is going to import inflation and export disinflation, deflation to the rest of the world. And so I think what we're seeing from the president is perhaps the setting up of a scapegoat or someone to blame, saying, oh, well, we wouldn't have this slowdown in growth if the Fed just acted sooner. And of course, whatever happens, we will never have the counterfactual. But we do know that if the Fed were to cut too soon, it would risk igniting inflation. We think that risk is somewhat mitigated because of what we're seeing in terms of the behavior of the 10-year rates, right? Even with Scott Bessent's comments today, we don't see the 10-year rallying all that much. And so if the Fed were to cut too soon, right, and that risk of inflation gets elevated, you're going to see 10-year rates go up. So it's not clear that would actually help the economy that much, where it really could serve to unanchor inflation expectations. So we think not only is the Fed going to be so-called fashionably late, but we think given their dual mandate, they are constitutionally, or I should say congressionally mandated to be a little bit late, and they're likely not to cut rates until June or so.
Constance, you mentioned Scott Bessent's remarks earlier today prompted quite a rally. I just wonder what you make of what he said. Wall Street is finding a positive spin on this. The status quo here apparently not sustainable. But if the Treasury Secretary is calling for de-escalation, does that mean that the reciprocal tariffs didn't work?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I would say it depends from whose perspective and how are we define working, right? Like if you're China and and this is going to really hurt your economy, and you've put on retaliatory tariffs, and now the U.S. is saying we're gonna walk back some of our side of the tariffs, then I guess from China's perspective, it did work. From our perspective, did it work? What are we trying to achieve? You know, there's been a lot of muddled communication with regard to what are these tariffs trying to achieve? Are they a revenue generator? Are they supposed to reduce imports and reduce our deficits, in which case they would not be generating as much revenue? Are they supposed to bring manufacturing back to the United States or bring manufacturing to the United States? It's not clear that is necessarily one of the goals. And if it is, we import so many intermediate goods that are part of our manufacturing process that tariffs are not really going to help facilitate that occurring. Is it a Juan Perón type policy where we're saying we actually want to make everything in the United States and we're not going to be integrated with the rest of the world at all? We know that's not a terribly successful policy track to take. So it's kind of unclear when we say work, what is the ultimate objective of the tariffs, and what is the ordering in which we should rank the various objectives that have been thrown out by the administration?
Constance, we just have a minute left here, but when you look at the bond market right now, what do you see and how worried about it are you?
I see an increase in term premium. I see the sell-off as being part of a global reallocation out of U.S. assets. And what we see day to day, of course, is the liquid assets. But we're also going to begin to see, and we are already beginning to see in terms of real estate, the selling of less liquid assets. And so that increase in term premium is going to prove, I think, very expensive if we continue along this direction.
All right, Constance, great to have you on Bloomberg TV and radio. Constance Hunter is chief economist at EIU, joining us here on Balance of Power as we consider this downgraded growth outlook and how it is timed with the words of Scott Bessent, though not technically on the record, not in public, not in front of the media, just sources saying that he views the tariffs with China as unsustainable. He thinks there will be a de-escalation. The problem is, Joe, no one is seemingly taking that first de-escalatory step at this point.
That is the problem. You have to pick up the phone and have a meeting at some point. Coming off our highs, so the S&P 500 still up 100 points. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.